Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Martin Hamilton. I'm Director of Leeds Civic Trust, and I'm delighted this evening to welcome my predecessor, Dr. Kevin Grady, to give a talk on A Stranger's Guide to Leeds in 1830. We're going to just to say how this will work. Kevin will talk, and then at the end of his talk, will be an opportunity to put questions to Kevin, and I'll field those questions. So if you want to use the chat function either during the lecture or at the end of the lecture, we'll try and gather those together and assemble some questions for Kevin to answer at the end. So that's how we plan to proceed. Now, I'm delighted to say that this talk is being given in association with the Thoresby Society, and I'm delighted that its president, Alan Slomson, is here this evening. I'd like to hand over to Alan to say a few words before Kevin starts.
Thank you, Martin. First of all, I'd like to thank the Leeds Civic Trust for hosting this meeting and Kevin for agreeing to give the talk. For those who don't know us, I should explain that the Thoresby Society is the Leeds Historical Society, and we're named after Ralph Thoresby, the first topographer of Leeds. Our home is now in the Leeds Library in Commercial Street, and this houses our extensive library and archives. To find out more about us, please go and find our website, and you'll be able to access on our website our wonderful collection of images, and you'll also find there an enormous amount of interesting information about Leeds. And of course, we welcome new members, and if you join us, you'll be helping us in our work of conserving the history of Leeds and disseminating it through our publications. We normally hold live talks in the evenings and at lunchtimes in November. It remains to be seen whether we'll be able to do that this year, but if not, I'm sure we'll hold some video meetings like this one to take their place. I'm sure we're all going to enjoy tonight's talk, and I'll hand over now to Kevin to tell us about Leeds in 1830.
Right, well, here we are. Thank you very much, Martin and Alan, for the introduction. I'm delighted to be giving this talk on behalf of the Civic Trust and the Thoresby Society. I have to say that this is my first Zoom lecture, so I'll be fascinated to see how the technology works out. But I have to say that this isn't my first Zoom performance, because of course I have an alter ego, and that alter ego, if we're lucky, is as Dr. Marvello the Magician. And so I've actually given 7 performances on Zoom as magician, and I'm used to seeing audiences of children jumping about as things vanish into thin air and appear from nowhere when I wave my magic wand. So it's a bit disconcerting not to be able to see the audience, but I gather we've got 152 people watching at the moment. Maybe more will join us, but I shall imagine you as if you were sitting in my public lectures at Trinity Church, or more recently at Leeds Minster. And I have to say that today's lecture is not one of great academic merit. It was actually written for fun a few years ago as a challenge. So, oops, yeah, there we are, yeah. So, A Stranger's Guide to Leeds in 1830. Just over 35 years ago, Dr. Colin Treen and I ran a weekend course on the history of Leeds, and in a curious attempt to link the fact that Dr. Treen and Dr. Grady were giving this talk, the Yorkshire Evening Post thought that they should try and describe us rather like Doctor Who, and so they said that the talk that we were giving for the weekend was a Tardis-type tour through time. Now, I was rather shocked by this alliterative attempt to describe our rather academic lectures, but the headline did fire my imagination. And I wondered to myself, was it possible in an illustrated lecture to take an audience back through time to recreate Leeds as it was at the end of the 1820s and to evoke its atmosphere. So in 1985, I produced a 1-hour lecture attempting to do just that. So today's lecture is a shortened version of this, but improved in various ways by the fact that over that period of some 30 years, I have actually been able to find many more images of the Leeds in 1830. And indeed, in fact, my backcloth at the moment is one of them, which is I'm actually sat in Leeds Parish Church in 1839. You can just see behind me on the other side the pulpit of the church. This was the medieval church before it was demolished. Now, before I attempt the lecture proper, I wanted to give some preliminary thoughts about how I've reconstructed Leeds in that time. Now, first of all then, the lecture describes a visitor's guided tour around Leeds on a specific day, and that is Thursday, the 20th of May, 1830. Now, the events of the day are fictitious, as is Mr. Smith, the visitor to Leeds, but otherwise the characters we meet are real people. The details of Leeds in 1830 and during the 1820s, the previous 10 years, are historically accurate. The background information is taken from the book that you see on the screen at the moment, which is Parsons and White's 1830 Directory of Leeds. The bulk of the pictures that you will see are contemporary views, and those which are not quite, so a bit slightly later than 1830, actually show street scenes in Leeds which have been very little changed since 1830. And of course, the contemporary details of the things that are going on in Leeds at the time are taken from the fact that I read the Leeds newspapers for the period. Another thing is to talk about the value of money. In 1830, £50 was a great deal of money, enough to support a family of 3, that's with 3 children, for 1 year. Alternatively, £50 would buy you a back-to-back house, a 1-up, 1-down cottage. The base map that I'm using for the tour of Leeds is Charles Fowler's 1831 plan of the town of Leeds and its environs, and this is just one section of the plan. Now, some of you I know who are watching are not particularly familiar with Leeds, but just to acquaint you with the general layout, you have the river running along the south side of the town. Briggate running up here is the principal street of the town. If you turned right halfway up Briggate, you'd go down to Kirkgate and you'd arrive at the parish church. On the other hand, if you came slightly down Briggate, you could go along Boar Lane into this area, which is the area in which we're going to start the tour effectively. And just to say, at the top left-hand corner would be the location of Hanover Square, which we'll meet in a moment. So, our visitor to Leeds is Mr. Smith. He's 30 years old. He's one of a new breed of 19th century man who is keen on collecting data and statistics and making surveys. He's never been to Leeds before. He is a Londoner, and he's about to present a lecture to his local literary and philosophical society about the industrial north. A friend of his father has offered to show him Leeds and its neighbourhood. So Mr. Smith leaves London on the courier stagecoach from La Belle Sauvage Public House or Coaching Inn at 1:30 in the afternoon of Tuesday, the 10th of May, 1830. On his 26-hour journey, he reflects on the state of England over the past decade. The country has been passing through the great economic and social changes now known as the Industrial Revolution. He's especially interested to see its effect in Leeds. He's heard a great deal about this. George IV is on the throne, and his private life is a disgrace and a dream for cartoonists. In these contemporary cartoons, we see on the left Queen Caroline and her lover Bergami, so rough and so hairy. And on the right, we see the cartoon George's Delight, which shows George IV with his mistress, Lady Cunningham, and they're quite a plump couple to look at them. The 1820s has been quite a tumultuous time in politics. There's been great agitation for reform of Parliament and the franchise. The middle and upper classes have been in constant fear of revolution of the working classes, and indeed the 1820s was ushered in by the Peterloo massacre in Manchester. We see an illustration of this at the bottom right here, which occurred in 1819. But what of Leeds itself? Well, its expansion has been phenomenal in the 1820s. Building development has been so extensive that Charles Fowler, surveyor, has produced a plan of the town of Leeds, but he's had to produce 3 additions in 11 years. An addition in 1121, another in 1821, another version which we see here in 1826, and another version in 1831, which I've just shown you. The changes have been dramatic, and at the bottom of this 1826 plan, he shows the public buildings, he lists the public buildings along there, but so much has been the expansion in the last 5 years up to 1826, he's had to list in very small writing probably 50 additional public buildings which have been erected in the period. Town population has grown by almost 50% to over 70,000 in just 10 years, while the number of houses in the town has also increased by almost 50% in the same period. So this is tremendously fast development, a phenomenon, and we see on this plan, we see out on the sort of southwest corner, laid out but not built upon, new streets where development might take place. Over at the bank on the east side, yet more plans for new streets, and right across from the Park Estate up on the slope, we'd see 2 projected new squares which were to become Hanover Square and Woodhouse Square. Now here we see Alphonse Dussault's view painted about 1830, and it's looking down on the town of Leeds from Middleton. So when Mr. Smith's coach is approaching Leeds, it comes in from the east side along Hunslet Road, and if he looked out of his coach, Mr. Smith would have seen Mr. Brooks' glassworks. As he went further along, if he looked across, he would have seen the Leeds pottery. But he's coming along Hunslet Lane and arrives at Christchurch Meadow Lane. He might have been able to see St. Paul's Church in Park Square, but at the church, the coach turns right to go up to Briggate, the principal street of the town, crossing the river. He'll see the tower of Holy Trinity Church as he goes up, and he arrives here at the Rose and Crown Inn, coaching in, that is, in a yard off Briggate. Here he is met at the Rose and Crown by, this is the site of the Thornton's Arcade today, by the way. He's met by Mr. George Rawson, a stuff merchant, that is a merchant in worsted cloth, one of the wealthiest men in Leeds, who takes him by carriage to his home in Hanover Square. And here we see Hanover Square. So they've come up Briggate, they've come along the hedgerow into Park Lane, and then come up into this newly laid out area. A couple of years before this, Mr. Rawson has bought the Denison Hall estate here with the big hall at the top there, but he's decided he would like to develop it as a high-class residential square, and he's built for himself at the bottom left-hand corner a new house. And I popped over to Hanover Square a couple of days ago, and there is Mr. Rawson's fine house at the bottom southwest corner of the square. Well, Mr. Smith has a well-earned rest overnight, but the following morning they get up bright and early, ready for a full day tour of Leeds, so he can get his bearings and see places that he may go back to in later days in the week that he's here. So their aim after breakfast is to walk down to the new commercial buildings. And in this view, we see pretty much a view from where Hanover Square is. And here we're looking down into Park Square, and we see the houses of Park Square on the east side, and within the square, St. Paul's Church, a proprietary church which had been built in the 1790s. So here we're back to the 1831 plan, and we can see that they come down here, they come along Park Lane, and they come in here. This Park Estate, the high-class residential estate, which has been built since the 1760s, and there is Park Square with St. Paul's Church at the corner. But they're going to come down here and walk along West Street, now known as St. Paul's Street, down Queen Street, where Queen Street Chapel is. They're going to go along Park Place, and then notice the wonderful gardens opposite the houses. And then they're going up there into Infirmary Street, passing the infirmary, the mixed cloth hall, and going down to the commercial buildings. And the location here is where City Square is today. So going through they go through it and down to Queen Street Chapel. Queen Street Chapel is an independent or congregational list chapel. Mr. Rawson is very proud of the church because it is here, he's one of the town's leading congregationalists, and he laid the foundation stone of this chapel in 1823. They then walk down Park Place and loop round to come into Infirmary Street. Now, this is a wonderful engraving that I managed to find in a bookshop a few years ago, and this is the view that they would have got in 1830 looking down the street. Mr. Rawson points out on the right-hand side the Leeds General Infirmary. He explains that this is a charitable institution giving medical treatment to the poor. It had been opened in 1771 and currently has beds for 99 patients. Sadly, however, he has to say that the infirmary is experiencing great financial difficulties. The newspapers say that its funds are exhausted. Going down the street, they go past the side of the mixed or coloured cloth hall, and in the distance here you can see the commercial buildings. So they come down the side of the cloth hall, out into this space, Ball Lane to our right here, and they come down to the top of Bishopgate Street and turn round and look at this wonderful vista. On the right, they see the commercial buildings, and then just part way up Park Row, they see the courthouse, and then just to the left is the rotunda of the coloured cloth hall. Mr. Smith has heard a lot about the Leeds cloth halls, and he's very anxious to see it as soon as possible. And here is the rotunda of the cloth hall, and they're going to go through this archway. Mr. Rawson explains that this hall opened in 1758 for the sale of coloured cloth. That is, cloth whose yarn has been dyed before the cloth is woven to create coloured cloth as opposed to undyed white cloth. Going through the entrance, they walk into the cloth hall yard. This is the largest cloth hall in Leeds, only a bit smaller than the Peace Hall in Halifax. Its hall is so big, its yard is so big that it can hold 20,000 people, and it's frequently used for large public meetings and election hustings. There's no trade in the yard today or in the hall because it's a Thursday. Mr. Rawson describes how the hall buzzes with activity on Tuesdays and Saturdays, the market days. The hall is actually divided within the wings into 6 streets or alleys with clothiers' stalls on either sides of the alleys. We're looking at the Infirmary Street side on the right-hand side of this picture with the light coming through from there. Trade in the hall has diminished significantly since the start of the 19th century due to the rise of merchant manufacturers and their woolen cloth mills, but over 1,500 clothiers still attend the market on market days. Having looked round the hall, they crossed the road to go to the commercial buildings, and here it is. In 1834, it was described as the most splendid, elegant and classical structure in Leeds. Mr. Rawson is especially proud of the building because he is one of the trustees of the company which owns it. It's only been open for 7 months and serves as a merchant exchange and was built at a cost of £34,000. It's the most expensive building in Leeds. Wealthy townsmen purchase shares at £50 a share to pay for this building. And just remember, the £50 share, they could have bought a back-to-back house for that price. Now, here is a very early photograph of the commercial buildings, shortly before it was demolished in the 1870s, I think. But what a hugely impressive building, and don't we regret the fact that it's no longer there. They decide to go inside. They go up the steps into the vestibule, and ahead of them is a screen of Ionic columns through which they see a magnificent circular saloon, 36 feet in diameter, with a grand staircase and a dome 60 foot high. The merchants meet here to transact business every day between 12 and 2. To the left of the entrance is the coffee room, and to the right is the commercial newsroom or reading room. Let's go in. Look at this. This is a watercolour painting of the newsroom, which is in the collection of the Thoresby Society. What an elegant and splendid room it is. Here, Mr. Smith is introduced to Thomas Benson Pease, aged 48. Like Rawson, he is a wealthy stuff merchant and also a trustee of the commercial buildings. His business is in Park Lane and his house is at Chapel Allerton. And what are their topics of conversation? The King's health. Is there any fresh news from London? The newspapers say that George IV is dying. In fact, he dies 4 days later. And what news is there in the Leeds Intelligencer newspaper that morning? The sad death is announced of the Reverend George Walker, aged 36, headmaster of Leeds Grammar School for the last 12 years and assistant minister at Holy Trinity Church. He was very highly thought of. Even more, well, excitingly, the Leeds and Selby Railway Bill has just passed both Houses of Parliament. It will be Leeds's first railway. Pease is delighted because he is one of the original shareholders in the railway. There's also an advert for Fowler's intended new plan of Leeds. There are already 300 subscribers, including George Rawson, and of course this is the map that we're using to guide us round Leeds on our tour. Coffee over, they all agree to meet for lunch and invite along another friend, Mr. Osborne, to join them. Mr. Rawson is to take Mr. Smith to see Benjamin Gott's famous factory. Mr. Pease will walk with them as far as the public baths on the south side of Wellington Street. So they're coming out of the commercial buildings and they're walking along Wellington Street, noting the wonderful gardens coming down to the street from the back of the infirmary and opposite the public baths. These are Turkish and spa baths built in 1820 at a cost of £7,000 by a company with £100 shares. Both Rawson and Pease are shell holders in the baths. You need to be subscribers to use them, and they're frequented by only the most respectable and affluent members of the middle and upper classes. I doubt whether some of you listening to this lecture would actually have been allowed in. Oh, and here are the public baths themselves. Again, classical and elegant, although this view from a shareholder's annual general statement doesn't do the building justice, I think. So they walk along Wellington Street, coming along here, and here is Benjamin Gott's wonderful woolen mill. Mr. Smith is very, very impressed, to say the least. Benjamin Gott is now 68 years old and a millionaire, literally a millionaire, at a time when 50 quid would buy you a cottage. This massive factory employs over 1,000 workers, making it one of the top 10 or 12 largest factories in the country. Above all, this is a cloth finishing mill with steam power used for fulling and shearing cloth. In fact, 3/4 of the cloth finished here, and of course sold by Gott, is actually bought in from small clothiers weaving the cloth in their own cottages. After having a quick look in the mill, Mr. Smith is going to come back on another day for a thorough tour. After that, they come out of the mill and walk to Wellington Bridge and cross it here. So Wellington Bridge, a toll bridge opened in 1818, has the river there, and on the other side, the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. They're not actually going to go completely over the bridge because they're going to walk down the towpath between the river and the canal. And here we see the mill, St. Paul's Church, Park Square, and for those of you with sharp eyesight, we see the commercial buildings and the tower of Holy Trinity Church. But here they are, the two of them, walking along the towpath. Mr. Rawson is gesturing and explaining to Mr. Smith about the town's industries. There's been an amazing expansion of factories in the 1820s. There are now over 70 factories or mills in the town. But he explains that Gott is not typical. The average mill has 75 workers, and only 1 in 20 workers actually work in factories. The domestic system of cloth making and the production of goods in small workshops still predominates. While the woolen cloth making, finishing and marketing is still the principal activity of the town, there are many other industries. For example, an extensive flax spinning industry, flax being used, of course, to make linen. There are several iron foundries. There's carpet making. There's the Leeds pottery, other potteries and glassworks. There's an extensive wholesale tobacco trade. there's a substantial leather industry and many other trades. So they walk, oh, I should just say, they're just about to walk under Monk Bridge. This is another new bridge, a toll bridge, and this had been opened 3 years earlier. So they walk along the canal towpath, walk through the canal basin, and arrive back at the canal. Rawson and Smith are joined by Mr. Pease and by William Osborne, aged 37, a wine and spirit merchant with premises on the Upper Hedgerow. Importantly, Osborne is secretary of the Leeds Philosophical and Literary Society, of which Rawson and Pease are proprietary members. Over lunch, their discussion ranges across political and social issues. Our friends are all nonconformists and Whigs. Though they have friends on the Leeds Corporation, they have nothing but contempt for it as an institution, because corporation members are all Anglicans and Tories. Indeed, until the repeal of the Test and Corporation Act in May 1828, nonconformists were disqualified from holding many public offices. They're keen for the reform of the corporation and Parliament. Thomas Pease would like to serve on the corporation, and in fact he is to achieve this in January 1836, when he became councillor for the Kirkgate ward under the reformed corporation. George Rawson is a great supporter of parliamentary reform. There are many worthy people in the town who cannot vote in elections, but worse still, the country is full of rotten boroughs like Aldborough near Boroughbridge, which elects 2 MPs to Parliament but only has 64 voters. In contrast, Leeds, the 6th largest town in England, has no MP at all. Very shortly, Mr. Rawson will be speaking at a public meeting chaired by John Marshall, advocating parliamentary reform. This picture shows Leeds Reform Association, its rally at the Coloured Cloth Hall. The captions on the flags read, "3 groans for the Queen, no petticoat government, etc. The bill, the whole bill, and nothing but the bill," by which they mean the Parliamentary Reform Bill. Mr. Smith asks about the problems of the poor and social discontent in the town. Yes, his hosts say, there have been problems with combinations, that is, trade unions, and there have been turnouts, that is to say, strikes, especially in 1824 and 1825, the biggest boom years in the 1820s. They've been worried too by political agitation stirred up amongst the working classes by William Cobbett and others. But they don't expect violent uprisings. And in any case, the cavalry barracks were built at Buslingthorpe in 1820, ready to deal with any problems. Happily, there has been very little trouble. Things have been hard, though. At the height of the Depression in 1826, which followed the huge commercial boom of the mid-1820s, over half the town's population was wholly unemployed or working just 1 to 3 days a week, and soup kitchens had to be open. Housing conditions are certainly a problem. Houses cannot be built fast enough, and many workers are having to cram into the yards and existing houses and cottages like these in the town centre. But there are some good houses being built, especially those being built by building clubs, which have been set up by the better paid skilled workers. But the absence of sewers, and on the right here we see particularly dilapidated street on the bank on Richmond Hill, which clearly there are no sewers and there are lots of mud. But, you know, the absence of sewers and good clean water supply is a big problem. And indeed, just too late, as of course, in 1832, there is the cholera epidemic, which killed 700 people in the town, more or less one person in every 100 inhabitants. Mr. Smith tells him that they believe, Mr. Smith's hosts tell him that they believe that bringing religion and education to the lower orders is a key to preserving good social order. Provision with regard to both of these has been particularly good in Leeds in the last decade. 3 million Act churches have been funded by Parliament specifically to provide Anglican church accommodation for the expanding populations in working class areas. These have been built in the mid-1820s, and on the left we see St Mary's Church, Quarry Hill, now demolished, and St Mark's Church, Woodhouse, up by the university, which happily still stands. Likewise, there has been a prolific building of non-conformist chapels. Here we see the fine Brunswick Methodist Chapel, which opened in 1825, stood beside the Merrion Centre, sadly demolished a few years ago. And this is just one of several, the new Baptist, Congregationalist and Methodist chapels erected in the mid-1820s. There are also a large number of Sunday schools in the town, which are very well attended. With regard to education, they report that the National and Lancasterian schools, that is monitorial schools for the working classes in the town, are flourishing. Here we see at the top the Parish Church National School. If you stood in the upper floors of the Civic Trust offices in Morph Street and looked out of the windows, had you been in that position in 1830, you would have seen the National School directly across the road. Lower down, we see the Lancasterian School, which was in Alfred Street, just south of Boar Lane. But for the majority of the working class children, they don't go to school other than to perhaps a few hours in factory schools or go to Sunday school. For the adults, there is Leeds Mechanics Institute, which was established in 1825, and George Rawson is proud to be one of its directors. But lunch is over, and it's time that we were off again. The next stage of the journey, they come out of the commercial buildings and they're going to go up Park Row, seeing the courthouse and the philosophical hall, and then just directly opposite beside the commercial buildings, Mill Hill Chapel. So here we see the courthouse. This had been opened in 1813 and housed the magistrates' courts, the police station and fire engines. In effect, it's the town hall. Opposite we have the 17th century Mill Hill Chapel. Park Row is going up on the left, the present day Basinghall Street on the right. So this is somewhat dilapidated and will be rebuilt for the building we know today 18 years later. And then we arrive at the philosophical hall. Park Row is going up where the carriage is going. But this is an absolutely wonderful view. This had been built in 1819 for the Leeds Philosophical and Literary Society, and it is Mr. Osborne's pride and joy as he's secretary of the institution, and it's the centre of intellectual life in the town. What's good about this view, apart from the wonderful view of the building, is that just on the right here we see the fine houses of South Parade looking south across an open space, and on the left we see the not quite so fine houses but really pretty good houses of East Parade looking across what had been an open space. Leeds Worthies have donated wonderful items to the Museum of the Philosophical Society, the most celebrated of which is the coffin case and mummy of Nessun Almun. Here you see the book, which had been written in 1828 by William Osborne, meticulously recording the Society's careful unwrapping and analysis of this mummy, which Mr. Blades had brought back from Egypt. Of course, today this mummy is the centerpiece of the City Museum's Egyptian collection. And of course, if you would like to see this actual book, which is really quite rare, you can find it in the library of the Thoresby Society. Well, we've been into the philosophical hall there. The next stage is that our visitors are going to walk along Bond Street through to Albion Street, take a quick look at the music hall, and then go back to Commercial Street and look at the Leeds Library. Here is the music hall. This had been erected in Albion Street in 1792. It was the musical and artistic centre of life for the middle classes in Leeds, with its music saloon and picture gallery. And here we see a wonderful engraving of the double height galleried music saloon in the music hall as it appeared in 1832, when the celebrated virtuoso violinist Paganini played there. And in another part of the building is the picture gallery. I discovered this wonderful watercolor a couple of years ago, and I was so excited because interiors of these buildings of these period are very, very rare. And to see this, the Northern Society held annual art exhibitions at the galleries, and there were others, and it's so splendid to see these rooms with all these pictures displayed. And next they move on to walk into Commercial Street, where they see the Leeds Library, established in the 1760s and still going today, financed by its 500 proprietors. I show you the inside because I'm particularly proud of this institution, as I am its president. But we must speed on. My buzzer just went. They walk along to the junction with Briggate, and had they turned into Briggate just 5 years earlier, this is the scene that they would have seen. Basically, the moot hall, the old moot hall or town hall, slap bang in the middle of what was a prestigiously wide street with moot hall, with the middle row behind it. As a result of the creation of the Improvement Commission, Act of Parliament obtained in 1824 to allow the levying of the Leeds improvement rate, and this allowed for the moot hall to be demolished with middle row behind it. And Mr. Rawson is particularly pleased with the changes, because this is how it now looked in 1830. The moot hall had gone, and right at the top of this newly paved Briggate, you could see the new Corn Exchange, not actually at the top of Briggate, but the hedgerow runs across there, and there is the new Corn Exchange, just erected, looking rather like the moot hall, and deliberately so. So our party walk up the side of the Corn Exchange. They've gone up Briggate, up the side here. They're going to have a quick look at the Harrison's Almshouses, then shoot down to the Grammar School on North Street and look at the workhouse. So here they are. They've walked around. They've come along Mark Lane to see Harrison's Almshouses with the church and the charity school. They then walk back to the top of North Street and see the Grammar School, still there. It had been rebuilt in 1624, and it educated really the children of the well-to-do people of Leeds. They then walk down a little bit to the bottom of North Street, and at the junction, it's now Vicar Lane, I think, at the junction with Lady Lane, they see the workhouse. This, of course, is totally inadequate for the town with its massive increase in population. And Mr. Rawson explains that these days very few people go into the workhouse, and by and large the poor law overseers actually give out relief payments to individuals and families in hard times. They then walk down Vicar Lane to where they come to the House of Recovery, the Fever Hospital, which had opened in 1804, and then round the side of the building they thread their way through back towards Briggate, coming through the Bazaar and Shambles, a beautiful new facility opened in the mid-1820s as a replacement for the Butcher's Shambles, which sat under and past the Moot Hall. They then walk down to Leeds Bridge, passing Mr. Dodgson's tea, coffee and hop warehouse, and then they look over the bridge, and here they see the Port of Leeds. This is a very important hub for the town. Here's a hive of activity, the new Air and Calder Navigation grain warehouse, the new, built in the mid-1820s, warehouse on the opposite side of the river, which still is there today and has been converted to flats. And then, of course, the parish church in the background. They're now going to walk over the bridge to see another hub of relatively new buildings in some cases, the theatre, Salem Chapel, the South Market, and Wesley Chapel. So crossing over, they see the theatre. Well, this is rather old and dilapidated. The Theatre Royal had been opened in 1770, and happily, again, I discovered when I was scanning some of the Thoresby Society's lantern slide that there isn't actually an interior view of this. This looks like a lantern slide made of a watercolour, I think, but here we see the proscenium arch of the interior of the Theatre Royal. Next door to it is Salem Chapel, Congregational Chapel, or independent in those days. Today, of course, it has a semicircular front, which will be familiar to some of you. And then immediately opposite, this absolutely wonderful new market. There was a market mania in Leeds in the mid-1820s, and these wonderful new buildings were erected. This hasn't been a success. Both Rawson and Pease have shares in it, but they're rather sad that they're not making much money. It's not trading well. And just on the opposite side of that, we have Wesley Chapel, with its opened in 1816, rather fine building, but in the distance we see Holbeck, the industrial heart in many ways, with Hunslet of the city. But before we go down there, we see the Middleton Railway bringing coal from Middleton Colliery into Leeds Bridge, with Christchurch Meadow Lane, the third of the Million Act churches, and then Holbeck in the distance. So they walk down Water Lane, walking to the east, and they see Matthew Murray's round foundry. Now, this is particularly famous. It's famous in England. It's the second most important foundry in England after Bolton and Watt's Soho foundry in Birmingham. Matthew Murray, seen here, died 4 years before Mr. Smith's visit, but the business is carried on by his son-in-law. There has been a big increase in steam engines manufacture and use in Leeds. Though use of steam engines as a source of power is exceptional, the number of steam engines in Leeds has doubled in the last 10 years to 225, approximately half of which have been made in Leeds. They continue down Water Lane to reach the flax mills of John Marshall. John Marshall is 65, still alive. He's the leader of and pioneer of the Leeds flax spinning industry. There are now 17 flax spinning firms in the town employing 5,000 workers. So successful is the industry that it produces 1/4 of the country's output of spun flax. Marshall's enterprise is a giant one, rather like Benjamin Gott's, and he employs 1,100 people. But they, like us, are running out of time, as it always tends to be in my lectures, and we'll need soon to stop so that we can have our tea or supper. I'm getting a bit hungry, so they're going to do the final stretch very quickly. They go back over Leeds Bridge because Mr. Walton wants to show Mr. Smith where the parish church is, because he'll be wanting to go to worship there on the Sunday. And so they walk along the calls, coming past the south side of the parish church, the medieval church in which I'm sitting at the moment. They go past, this faces the river, they go past the church, and Mr. Smith is taken up onto Richmond Hill and the bank. So this is an 1826 engraving of Leeds. So they can look down on the town, a hive of industry with all its smoke, and to some, very impressive. We see the Aaron Calder navigation, and there is Leeds Lock, the first lock on the navigation. We see the weir running across there, and of course the Royal Armoury is situated beside Lock today. And in the distance we see the parish church, Holy Trinity Church, up on the hilltop, St. John's Church. But what an impressive scene if you were hoping to see a centre of dynamic and greatly progressive industry in this country. So they leave there, they walk back along East Street, then known as the Causeway. They come past the parish church and come up Kirkgate. On the left we see the Free Market, formerly Vicar's Croft, where today Kirkgate Market is. And then crossing over from there, they come into Duncan Street. Now again, Mr. Smith is astonished by this view. Looking down Duncan Street, on the right-hand side, they see the Central Market. Yet another market, he says. This again has been a company, a joint stock company. The money has been raised in shares, and yet another impressive classical building, built and opened in 1827. Well, they go down the street towards Holy Trinity Church, into Boar Lane, and finally arrive back at the commercial buildings. Well, what a day for a soft southerner. Mr. Smith feels walked off his feet, but very excited and inspired by what he's seen. During the course of the day, Mr. Smith has walked 8 miles and of course gone into some buildings as well. The subsequent days of his stay were equally strenuous. 6 days later, on Wednesday the 26th of May 1830, at 2 o'clock, he departed for London aboard the Royal Union stagecoach from the White Horse Hotel, Boar Lane, opposite Holy Trinity Church. So thank you very much. Now, of course, if you were a group of children watching me perform as Dr. Marvello, I would be saying to you, now children, they always need a little cue, you must give me a big clap. Well, of course, you can do that in your homes if you want. And of course, had this been one of my public lectures at Holy Trinity Church or the parish church at Leeds Minster, I would have asked you a prize question. And for the first person who shouted out the answer, based on the content of the lecture, I would have presented them with a prize. But I can't do that. But the prize is I'm handing you back to Martin to continue the proceedings.
Kevin, that was great, and goodness me, the poor chap must have been exhausted after that tour, and covering so much ground in an hour. I mean, do you think they were jogging around in between visiting the buildings? I think there must have been. Maybe a bit of time travel involved even. So very, very impressive. I mean, that was a fascinating talk, Kevin, and I know we've had a lot of questions and comments coming up on the chat function. Could I maybe just start by asking perhaps a general question about the development of the city in and around this time? So, you know, the 1830s and the buildings that you've referred to in the run up to that date. How did they happen? Who decided where buildings should be, how wide streets should be, what the views should be? How was that actually decided? What was the governance of that? Was it random? Was it ad hoc? Was it money led? Was there a master plan, as we would talk about in these times? How did it work?
Well, I mean, the answer basically is that there was no master plan, and there were no planners. Effectively, the corporation itself, of course, was really a dining club, although it had certain functions on key committees, and its chief members were magistrates, JPs for the borough. So, you know, they oversaw the life of the city, but basically you were able to, if you spotted an eligible building plot and you thought you could make money from putting up these public amenities, effectively you just got on with it. I mean, the Improvement Commission, which became rather more important in many ways than the corporation, because it did have powers of, you know, it provided the street lighting, the Improvement Acts, of which there were several, allowed them to regulate pavements, to insist that people didn't throw their rubbish out into the streets, that they covered over wells, that you know, and they could finance, as we saw with Briggott, they could finance the repaving and of streets and their improvement in various ways, but they didn't have powers to do with things like sewage systems or water supply, and it was only sort of after that, in the sort of 1830s and 40s, that we get control of that sort. So effectively, I mean, the one of the comments, it was a rather wonderful one, I think, that dated from the 1830s, where somebody wrote to the paper and he said, "I've been to visit Leeds and it seems it's had an earthquake for an architect." And literally, I mean, you just think, I mean, this amazing thing, over a period of 10 years, you know, we thought in, you know, the building boom before, you know, the crash a few years ago, we went on for 10 years, 12 years of exceptional development. But in the period in the 1820s for people in Leeds, it just must have been astonishing. And of course, people just thought, oh, I'll buy a field. Maybe I could lay it out for streets of houses. And the question was, you know, would people come along, want to take up the property, you know, the land and build? So it was eventually totally random.
Kevin, Roderick Parker just asked an interesting question here, which is, what were the streets paved with? What did they use? Because there never seems to be any water or mud on these pictures.
Ah, well, of course. You see that
using the modern architect's, you know, artistic impression, do you think?
Well, yes, I think this is the thing, isn't it? That these engravings, particularly say the Whittock engravings of the late 1820s and things, of course, they are to celebrate how fine the city is. And I mean, interestingly, you look at, I mean, I was looking at that, I included that photograph of the commercial buildings, one of the few photographs in the whole lecture, because I thought, well, that was the commercial buildings in the 1860s, and even though it had been there for what, 30 years, almost 40 years, it wasn't totally blackened. So in one sense, you know, we think of the town hall as having been totally black, you know, within living memory. But at that stage, although there was, you know, a lot of soot and grime, the fact was the place wasn't quite as dirty as it had been. But yes, I mean, the streets, I mean, well, the point is that where there were streets of houses, I mean, these were done by individual property owners who had a field and thought, right, I'll create some streets of back-to-back houses. They didn't actually need to pave the streets. There was no requirement for it. And of course, in particular, they didn't need, until we're into the 1840s, there was no obligation on them to provide sewers. So yes, I mean, the principal streets were In the case of Briggate, paved with stone. Of course, you know, we are in the era of Portland cement, of course, and of course it was William Joseph Aspdin who invented Portland cement in the one of the yards off Briggate, which of course was very important in the surfacing of roads. So, you know, you're getting all sorts of stuff put into the surfaces, but it was always thought very fine if you could pave your streets with stone. And certainly, I think in the Park Estate, you know, the high-class residential estate, that would have been the case.
I mean, you mentioned, you showed us some images of markets that popped up, you know, in very quick succession. And then you made reference towards the end to this is where Kirkgate Market ended up. What was the sort of, you know, why did markets suddenly appear? And, you know, how long did they last? I mean, did they survive into the 20th century, the 19th century, you know, the late 19th century? Why was Kirkgate Market built when these other markets apparently hadn't necessarily done very well?
Well, I mean, the point is that until I must get this right, until the 1820s, other than the cloth markets in the cloth halls, all the other markets of the town, whether it was cattle markets, horse markets, corn markets, you know, the markets for all sorts of goods were held in the streets of the town. So up to this point, well, say up till the 1820s, effectively, you know, on market days, I mean, Leeds had one of the biggest markets in the north of England, renowned for the supplies of fish and vegetables and all this sort of thing. And the whole of Briggate was one market street, which was totally taken over for market purposes on Tuesdays and Saturdays. And then the adjacent streets, I think the cattle market was in Vicar Lane, you know, the horse market and things like that. But then, of course, you get this huge expansion in the 1820s. So the population of the town doubles. But then, of course, with the cloth trade, the selling of cloth and all other things, thousands of people came into Leeds. So I'm sure it's perfectly right that probably the population of the town of Leeds doubled on market days. And of course, they were buying goods. They were coming in from the countryside, the clothiers with their cloth, and they were actually buying all sorts of goods in the town. Well, of course, in order to clear the streets, one of the things that the improvement commissioners did was to buy the Vicar's Field, this large field on Kirkgate, and take it over. And they bought him a house in Park Place. And then the field became the cattle market and the fruit and vegetable market. But then, of course, you see, this is an era in which people are looking to sort of greater gentility. And they thought, so, you know, the central market had shops inside it, but it also, because it was close to the new shambles, had butcher shops and fish shops. And also these markets quite often had bazaars in them. And on the balcony of the central market, you could buy what they termed fancy goods. The South Market, the idea there was that you had all these people coming into Leeds over Leeds Bridge, and the proprietors thought they could capture the trade of people coming into town and that they would buy their stuff there. And that had, again, butcher shops and you know, greengrocers and things like that, and fancy good shops, but they miscalculated and most people just went past. But you know, the point was the 1820s and the 1830s in the middle, these were the ages of speculation. Everybody thought they could make money, you know, in the 1830s and 40s in the middle, because it was the railway mania. But you know, it was all about, oh, you know, what's the latest investment, let's put money into this, that and the other. And of course, you know, well, I mean, the central market survived, I think, until the 1890s. In fact, it caught fire, and there are wonderful photographs of it, blackened with the smoke, with a policeman standing inside, and you know, others got, you know, cleared for road widening and things like that.
Kevin, you showed us the commercial building, which was, you know, an incredible structure.
Yeah.
Do we know who built? Do we know who designed it? Do we know why it was demolished?
Well, it was built. The architect, I think, was John Clark, notable formerly Edinburgh architect. I think he designed, for example, the General Cemetery, St George's Field, up at the university. So he did a variety of things. The thing about the commercial buildings was that, again, I mean, I don't think it worked as a merchants' exchange, but the question was, as trade, business in it went down. I mean, it had insurance companies' offices in and things like that upstairs, but I think they sort of decided it was fit for purpose. And they did think what Leeds lacked was a large room. And at one point they thought, well, could it part of it become a concert hall? Mm. And their hopes of this were dashed when the Leeds Town Hall was built. So for one reason or another, they didn't think it was configured properly. So surprisingly, in the early 1870s, it was demolished and it was replaced by the Royal Exchange building, which some people watching may just about remember. It had been demolished, I think, in the early 1960s. But I mean, the Royal Exchange was a fantastic building too, and it had statues of medieval and Saxon kings across the front. A wonderful building, but again, of course, that was flattened too, property development, and it was demolished for a new office block, I would think, about 1965. And of course, now we know that office block has the Crown Plaza Hotel in City Square. So, Leeds has been developed and redeveloped over the years, but thankfully, despite the development that's been going on in recent years, somehow, and it's to a considerable degree due to the efforts of the Leeds Civic Trust over many years, that we've managed to maintain the essential Victorian core of the city centre, which is so important to us.
Kevin, a different question. Adam asks if you could say anything about how the wealth and resulting development of the city related to the slave trade. To what extent was Leeds tied up with the slave trade?
Well, I think the straightforward answer to that is not a great deal. I think primarily because, of course, we weren't especially involved in trading in the goods that were circulating in the trade triangle. I think when I was thinking, because we've been thinking about this issue about, well, the issue of plaques, do they commemorate people who might not be thought quite so worthy these days? In actual fact, I think that, of course, when the slavery was abolished in 1833, if you owned slaves, you could apply for compensation, a very large amount of compensation from the government. And in fact, as far as I'm aware, there was only one person who claimed compensation in Leeds, that is, and that was somebody living in Chapel Allerton. No reflection on them, but basically that was the only one. And happily, as it turns out, it's not somebody who was celebrated with any of the Trust Blue plaques. But of course, I mean, Leeds was very strong in the anti-slavery movement. Of course, William Armistead was one of the leading figures for that in Leeds. And of course, the Leeds Library, a couple of years ago, actually ran some very interesting lectures and discussions and an exhibition of the books that the library has on the anti-slavery movement in Leeds. So, of course, I mean, obviously, I mean, as we know, the classic example, now part of Leeds, I suppose, in the sense that Harewood House, of course, was largely funded from the profits of the slave trade. But I haven't yet come across any sort of Leeds merchants who can be seen to be associated with the slave trade and slavery. However, of course, as people dig deeper, maybe that may be the case.
Kevin, at this time then, where would you say, in broad terms, poorer people were living in Leeds and where were the middle classes living? What were the sort of areas? Well,
the thing is that in the 18th century, effectively, rich and poor lived cheek by jowl. And it was only from the mid 18th century that, you know, the wealthier people started moving out to what I call the pleasant northern slopes, out up to Little Woodhouse, up to Headingley and those sort of areas. But of course the thing is, and this is the deceptive thing, of course, you look at those wonderful street scenes shown on the engravings with these fine classical buildings and what have you, and of course what it doesn't show is, of course, that behind these elegant frontages, particularly on the east side of the town centre, were all the yards, of course, which were crammed with cottages, and this applies to Briggate too, crammed against the walls of the yards. No sewage. I mean, the boot and shoe yard on Briggate, I think, was it 239 cartloads of, quote, manure were removed from that yard immediately after the cholera epidemic. So people were absolutely crammed into the yards, and that poverty, you just saw a little glimpse of it in some of the pictures I showed, but a lot of people were living in very cramped accommodation and, you know, without sewerage and very poor. But of course the wealthy, the well-to-do, if they didn't move out to the northern suburbs, were living in the Park estate, which, you know, had been created by the Wilson family, and the notion that it would be another Bloomsbury or another Bath. And it was, you know, there were heavy restrictions and covenants on the leases of the site to say you can't have a, you know, you can't have also any sort of noxious trade you couldn't pursue there. So that was the idea. But of course then the smoke blew across the town centre from Benjamin Gott's woolen mill. And of course, they were very upset in the mid-1820s. There was a trial of Benjamin Gott because the smoke from his mill was turning the grass in Park Square black, and it was ruining ladies' washing and things like that. But basically, predominantly, I mean, Maurice Beresford's wonderful book, East End, West End, of course, portrays the fact that it was the east side of the city centre. I mean, Kirkgate, off the frontages, was a den of vice and iniquity in all sorts of ways. So it's, you know, oh, and of course the Irish were up on Richmond Hill and the Bank. So predominantly the poorer off were living east of Briggate, and the well-to-do were living west of Briggate.
Last couple of questions, Kevin. A question about allotments.
Yes.
Where were the allotments? Was Leeds like Sheffield, Durham, Birmingham, where allotments sort of surrounded the city? Where were they?
Well, of course, at that time, there weren't allotments, although you know, within the town centre, there were still some spaces, small fields, but of course these were rapidly, of course this is the period when any field suitable like Vicar's Croft was being gobbled up. One of the things I find fascinating is that there were, on the top of Richmond Hill, if you look at the Ordnance Survey plans, I think certainly for, you know, the 1851, on the top of Richmond Hill, you see laid out an extensive area which is just gardens. Now, whether this was, you know, market gardening, I'm not too sure, but basically, certainly they exist and they bear much more investigation. And of course, if you moved out from the sort of quite densely built town centre, of course, you wouldn't get gardens with the street after street of back-to-back houses. And of course, this was an issue from the point of view of the creation of public parks. But allotments, yes, I think on top of Richmond Hill, and of course famously, although they disappeared, in the Middle Ages, the burgesses of Briggate were given allotments, I think 1/4 of an acre at Burman Tots, Boroughmen's Tots. But I think this is the sort of thing you need to ask somebody like Colin Sheen about, who is the expert on landscape gardening and this sort of thing in the, well, certainly in the 19th century, and of course did his great work on the suburban development of North Leeds in the Victorian period.
Kevin, final question. You mentioned the building boom, so-called, prior to the last recession.
Yes.
Yeah, the last recession, yeah. I get mixed up on which recessions we're on, but yes, the building boom sort of prior to 2008, I suppose.
Yes.
I mean, Leeds. You could say that this was another period of building boom. Would you say then, sort of looking at the development of Leeds as a whole, that this period was probably the period where the most was going on in terms of just general development? Would you say that you would pick out that decade maybe? Or do you think there were other periods that would compare?
So you're talking about the 1820s as the decade?
Yeah.
Well, I think the 1820s was exceptional because it was preceded by the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. So, that the economy had been depressed over that period. And then, once Napoleon had been defeated, then things started to loosen up and things started to expand. I think actually if you, of course you do get, what we used to call the trade cycle with, developments probably every 10 years with booms. But I think actually the period that strikes me most, other than of course we say the, the more modern crash, was the Edwardian period. And over the years I've given a lecture on Edwardian Leeds, and it's from sort of about 1895 until about 1910. This is when so much of central Leeds is transformed. And if you think of Briggate, you go up Briggate and you've got the County Arcade, all the developments, wonderful terracotta buildings, Leeds Estates Company, the arcades built, going over into Vicar Lane with all the, Coronation House being the coronation of Edward the Seventh and things like that. There were huge development and redevelopment on the east side of Briggate, really, and that with lots of other buildings. I mean, I do a tour where we go round Edwardian Leeds. You think of things like the Jubilee Hotel opposite the Town Hall, the Metropole Hotel, all sorts of things. So that was again a really transformative period. I say probably from about 1895 to 1910. So you go through, there's always changing going on in Leeds because it's such a dynamic city. But there are particular periods when you always think, as we used to think pre-2008, if somebody hadn't been to Leeds for 10 years, they'd arrive and certainly be shocked. And of course, that was the situation if they arrived in Leeds in 1830 and hadn't been for a decade.
It seems to me that this period was maybe the period when, what would you call them, statement buildings maybe first appeared, big, impressive buildings where you'd say, wow, this is an important place. As you say, in the decades following that, more of that happened. The Town Hall, the 1890s, early 20th century. But I guess you could look at this period, the 1820s, and that sort of period as the period when some very, very important and big buildings appeared on the city's landscape.
Yes, I think it was a dramatic change, and of course it's partly a question of finance. I mean, the thing is, up to that period and until the reform of Leeds Corporation in 1835, you weren't going to get any major buildings provided by a local authority. But of course, this development of what really were unincorporated joint stock companies, where you could all pull together. I mean, something like the commercial buildings had something like 300 shareholders. The same with the South Market, the same with the Central Market, the same with the Corn Exchange. So this is the era where people paying, subscribing to £50 shares, sometimes £100 shares. I mean, again, I always used to say with the General Cemetery at the University of St George's Field, 50 quid would get you in because you bought a share in the cemetery, which of course obviously gave you rights to be buried there behind high walls for fear of body snatchers. But this was collective enterprise, and I think it's that form of financial method which allowed these wonderful buildings, extravagant buildings to be built. And of course, you wanted to show up, this is, these people in Leeds, I mean, Rawson and Pease are tremendously wealthy people.
Well, Kevin, maybe the visitor to Leeds from London was so impressed that he decided to buy a £50 share in the summer, buried in Leeds at the end of his life. Who knows? He may well have done. We're going to have to draw things to a halt there. We've had a good session of questions to follow up the lecture. Kevin, I'll thank you properly in a second, but just a couple of notices. If you've enjoyed this lecture and the questions, we will of course be sending you a link to a recording, so you can revisit the images. So one or two people have asked if you could see the slides again. Well, you can do that at your leisure by looking at by clicking on the link that we'll send through in the next couple of days, and you can watch the lecture again. If you've enjoyed this and would like to join in another of these, I'll be giving a talk at the end of the month, 29th of July, on sculpture in Leeds, a virtual tour of Leeds City Centre through its sculpture. That's at a slightly later time of 7 o'clock. We've got some further events coming up in August, which we'll be informing you about in due course. But Kevin, it just remains for me to thank you very much for giving such a fascinating lecture, such a lot of information and a real sense of how Leeds developed in that important period. So we can't give you a round of applause, but people are using the chat function to say how much they enjoyed the talk. With that, I'd like to thank Kevin. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening, and hope you have a very nice evening. Good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.